Hello, explorer. Tonight our pages flip to the Wendigo, a cannibalistic spirit of the Native Americans. Together we will understand the world they lived in and how they perceived this creature. I would love for you to like and subscribe, but only if you're glad for the perspective you're about to receive from me. And please comment where in the world you're from and what time it is. It's very interesting for everyone to know who's listening in. Find your most comfortable position to rest in as the crickets sing to their families. And let's get on to our Native American folklore story. In the Native American forests, the wind shifts before the snow arrives, not in a dramatic gust, but in that slow, gliding way that you feel more in your bones than your skin. Trees seem to creak more thoughtfully, and the damp moss that once smelled like riverbank in autumn now carries a drier, more bitter breath. In the North Woods, among the Algonquin-speaking peoples, Cree, Ojibwe, Innu, and the others, this shift is felt not only in the weather, but in the way people move, speak, and cook. Winter isn't a season, it's an event, and every year it brings with it the possibility of something ancient stirring in the tree line. By late fall, preparations are nearly complete. The caches are full, or close enough, lined with dried strips of meat, roots with the dirt still clinging, and berries shriveled into leather. Smokehouses leave the air perfumed with pine and fat. Children, usually quick to forget chores, now move quietly under wool wrappings, their laughter softened by the way cold carries sound. Everything smells like wood smoke and tallow. Fires are built low and often. Their embers are watched with the same reverence given to elders. Ash patterns are read the way others read omens, not for magic, but for memory. The old stories told around those fires aren't always about bravery or tricksters. Sometimes, especially in the evenings when the cold bites the back of your neck, they turn to creatures with hollow ribs and lips too dry to bleed. No one says these creatures' names unless they must, and when they do, the air itself seems to pull back. By the time the first snow settles, it looks as soft as sifted flour on spruce needles. Yet somehow every sound becomes painfully obvious. Footsteps crunch too loudly. Crows no longer caw. They mutter as if they're wary of being overheard. Dogs, if the village has them, grow more restless. They sniff the air, then retreat closer to human breath. On the coldest nights, they sleep with their backs to the wind and their noses tucked in their fur, whimpering at things no one else can see. Inside the lodges, everything is layered. Blankets and furs covering the walls and floors. The woven walls creak faintly as they expand and contract with each gust of wind, and families sit closer. The elder always sits nearest the fire, not just out of respect, but because cold reaches their bones first. Their skin, leathered and worn, seems to sense something beneath the weather itself. They tell the younger ones to eat plenty but chew slow, not just for digestion, but for the discipline of controlling hunger. Otherwise, they might one day never be full. No one is truly alone once the snow sets in. Even when someone walks out to fetch water or split firewood, their return is watched from the corners of half-frozen windows or bark flaps. Not from fear, but from the understanding that winter changes things. Men come back looking thinner than they left, even after just an hour. Some speak less, their words dropping like icicles instead of floating like smoke with levity and life. And then there are the woods, dense, towering, and completely stoic. The trees don't mourn the passing of summer. They simply wait, branches frozen in place with sharp nakedness. Paths that were familiar in September now twist slightly under snow, like they're testing memory. The birds are fewer too, and those that remain do not sing melodies. One can stand perfectly still in a snowy clearing and hear nothing but their own breath, like the forest is holding its lungs just long enough to listen to you. These people, bundled in fur and sitting by fires, wrapping their babies in rabbit pelts, are not naive or helpless. They understand their land better than they understand themselves. But they also know that not everything can be tracked or explained. Not everything walks on 2 legs or even 4. Some things move with sheer presence, carrying the weight of feelings and instincts. They're only given real shape when paid too much attention. Even in good years, when the harvest is strong and the game fat, There's an edge to the cold. People watch for more than frostbite. They look for signs that something went off. A hunter returns with too little meat but too much silence, no comments about the poor search. A man dreams of eating his own hands. A woman wakes up talking in a voice that's not quite hers. None of these prove anything on their own, but taken together, they start to make people sleep closer to each other and watch the tree line more. Winter in these woods is never just about weather. It's about thinning boundaries between man and beast, dreams and memories, hunger and personal identity. And each year, the people prepare not just their bodies, but their minds, their stories, and their silences. Because once the winds shift and the old hunger stirs, you're not just trying to survive the cold. You're trying to remember who you are before it convinces you of something otherwise. The lodges grow quieter still as the nights stretch like sinew over bone. Stories become implied, less direct. No one ever says the Wendigo is here. They say it's too quiet tonight, or the trees feel thin. They wrap their words like they wrap their own bodies, in layers meant to protect and obscure from the harshness of direct exposure. No one stares into the woods when it's dark anymore during these times. They glance sideways or downward towards the fire. A woman might wake up early to find footprints outside her lodge, too large for any man, too deep for soft snow. But she says nothing, not because she's afraid, but because she knows what happens when you give certain things shape by talking about them or thinking about them. However, her husband sharpens his knife twice that day, and the stew is salted with trembling hands. Nothing was said aloud, but that evening, no one lingers by the door. And somewhere, not too far, but not quite near them, something does stir in the tree line. It doesn't breathe so much as echo, and the air around it folds in slightly, giving it shape. And the snow where it passes never quite settles right, but for now it waits, because winter has only just begun. By the time the Wendigo wants to make itself known, it doesn't burst through the trees or howl across the ridge lines. It arrives the way mold does in a forgotten pouch of berries, slowly and invisible to an eye that isn't watching for it. The first signs are not visual, because the Wendigo doesn't need to be seen to be known. At its root, it is a distortion, a bending of the normal, the comforting, and the safe, and the first thing it usually warps is the air. Those who have survived its proximity speak of a smell that arrives before anything else. It's not rot, not quite, more like cold sweat on old fur, or wet stones that have been lying beneath something dead. It hovers low and it doesn't disperse with the wind. It crawls into the nostrils and sticks behind the teeth, like a stubborn taste of burned meat. Elders say it's the breath of hunger itself, a feeling, a smell that can only come from something that has fed too much and yet remains impossibly empty. Dogs, when they're around, notice it first. Their noses wrinkle and hackles raise, and their bodies tuck low to the ground, not in fear, but in disgust. They refuse to go near certain trees anymore, or they bark at snowbanks that don't move. And at nights, when they turn away from the door and hide their noses, as we've mentioned, they sometimes just vanish, slipping into the dark one night and never returning. No blood, no tracks. People try to explain these things at first. A predator in the forest that they couldn't find. Wolves coming closer because of the harsh winter. Maybe the dogs chased something because they were hungry. But no one says it with much conviction, because alongside the smells, other things begin to go wrong and signal the signs. At night, the wind changes tone. Normally it howls or whistles or groans, but now it sometimes hums, long and low, like it's dragging across something hollow. Fires don't burn as cleanly. They flicker oddly, throwing shadows that stretch in strange directions. In one of the villages, a fire pit flares blue for 3 nights straight, and no one sits close to it anymore. They cook by coals alone after that, even though it takes longer and singes their fingers. Then things begin to vanish. Not people, but little things. A ladle carved from birch, a child's beaded slipper, dried strips of elk meat strung high between 2 poles, tied in triple knots, gone by the morning. No prints, no drag marks of anything being pulled out of place. just empty space and undisturbed snow. That kind of silence isn't peaceful, it's a warning. Those who go looking for dogs, the missing objects, or simply to give themselves peace of mind don't always come back with peace of mind, or even in the same condition they left in. One man, the eldest son of a respected hunter, returned after 3 days with snow caked into his eyelashes and a nosebleed that refused to clot. He wouldn't say where he'd been, just that the trees were very close together, even in the clearing. He stares at his hands more than he speaks now, and he eats much too fast for the elder's comfort. The people don't need convincing after that. They begin to sweep out the lodges each night, not for cleanliness but for scent, burning cedar and sweetgrass to crowd out anything else. Small offerings are left at the edge of the woods, bits of fat, carved bone tools, a child's braided hair wrapped in some sinew. It's not bargaining, it's more like a habit, born of their old memories, reminding that they are a people with memories. Somewhere during all this, someone always says, "I can feel the hunger." Not their own, and not anyone's nearby. Just hunger, as if the word itself has shape and feeling to it. And those who hear the phrase feel something small twist in their belly, even if they've just eaten. The next stage is the dreams. Those are hard to explain and even harder to shake. They begin subtly, people waking with dry mouths, muttering about too many teeth. A grandmother wakes and insists that someone chewed her sleeve in the night, even though it lies untouched beside her. A boy dreams of cooking his own fingers over a fire, and cries quietly when he sees his hands in the morning. The Wendigo doesn't rush, it lets fear do part of the work. It waits while people grow cautious and paranoid, driven half mad. Some start to whisper at night even when no one else is listening. Others fall into long silences during the day, staring too long at the tree line or into the stew pot. Hunting becomes more difficult. Tracks vanish mid-trail, and animals seem thinner than they should be. An entire trapline goes quiet for 6 days straight, and then one morning it's found strung with torn fur. Nothing edible, just shreds caught on the wood, as if something had deliberately desecrated the line out of spite with its own remains of a meal. And then there's the sound. It doesn't come every night, but it always returns eventually. Not a growl or a howl, more like a breath through the gaps in a skull or the flaps in a tent. It moves slowly, like someone dragging a bag of bones through frozen leaves. The first time it's heard, a woman's child wets himself in his sleep and wouldn't stop shaking until morning. The second time, someone whispers the creature's name and the friar crackles as if struck. No one says it again for weeks. By now, people sleep in even more layers, not just of cloths and furs, but silence. Conversations shrink, and movements become much more deliberate. The normal sounds of daily life are subdued. No one sings when they cook, and laughter when it comes is tight and brief. The creature still hasn't been seen, but it still doesn't need to be. Its presence is very much felt. The world itself is bending slightly under the weight of its existence. But still, life must go on. Meals are cooked, babies are rocked to sleep, wood is chopped. But now every task is done with an ear turned slightly towards the woods. Every footstep is followed by the quiet question in the people's minds. Did I hear that right? They know it's close, not because they see it, but because everything else starts to behave like prey. When these symptoms don't resolve through the enduring silence of the tribe's people, they begin to ask the elders for guidance. They carry their memories in everything they do, in the way they weave or carve without looking at their hands, in the way their eyes narrow when children speak too loudly at night. One of them, a woman whose hands are permanently curled from years of weaving and frostbite, begins singing again. Not lullabies, but the kind of tonal old phrases that rise and fall like a bird calling out in the fog. She doesn't explain the words, and no one asks her to. The songs aren't for them. These elders remember more than they admit. One of them once watched his brother fall to the Wendigo, not in a blizzard or on a lonely trail, but slowly at the center of camp, surrounded by fire and their family. This memory sits behind his eyes like a trapped animal. When this elder speaks, his voice is dry and deliberate. He says things like, Don't leave me drying out too long. And never trust a man who stops shivering in the cold. At night, he mutters into the fire like it's the only thing that still listens to him. They begin to bring out the old tools. Not weapons exactly, though some serve that function, but things carved for remembering. A narrow blade of stone, wrapped in red thread and etched with a pattern too precise to be decorative. A pouch filled with bone dust and crushed pine resin. A small, flat piece of driftwood with a circle burned into it, blackened to the grain. These objects are not meant for killing or repelling, but simply for tracking. These items are also not used openly. They are placed beside beds, tucked into the lining of moccasins, or buried shallowly beneath the ash of doorways. They are quiet defenses that provide the power of knowledge. The elders also begin to watch people more closely, especially the quiet ones. Not because silence itself is suspicious, but because it can mean shifts in thoughts. They listen for changes in the way someone chews, how they sleep, whether their footsteps falter between shadow and light. They don't announce this to the tribe. They just observe, like you would watch an animal for signs of illness. They see a man who once laughed easily might now wince when someone offers him broth, or a woman who's sharpening her bone needle will do it 3 times in one sitting, even though it's already sharp enough to pierce the hide she's working. And still, the elders do not panic. Panic leads to stupid mistakes, and the Wendigo is watching eagerly for its chance. One night, an elder lays tobacco into the snow at the edge of the lodge, pressing it gently into the drift as if tucking it into bed. He murmurs something into his old people's tongue, short and rhythmic, almost impatient. When he returns inside, he dusts the snow from his hands and sits as if nothing happened. But everyone in that lodge sleeps a little closer together that night. Stories begin to surface, told in the old way, through gesture and implications. One elder tells of a cousin who once went into the woods with nothing but a flint and a cracked bowl, and returned 2 weeks later carrying 3 fox pelts and no memory of where the 4th might have gone. Another mentions a hunter whose shadow didn't follow him back across the snow, and how no one would eat with him after that. These are not told for entertainment or to confuse people. They are told like weather warnings. They may be vague, but they are shaped by experience and carry lessons in them. Some stories are simpler and more straightforward. An elder might tell a child not to sleep with their back to the door. The Wendigo, after all, isn't a clumsy beast or a mindless curse. It's something with ability to recall, of paths taken, names whispered, who might be vulnerable in the night. The elders know that speaking its name as well can directly stir it, so they give it other titles: the Thin One, the Frost that Eats, the Hunger that Moves. They speak around it the way one skirts around a frozen lake. There's also the matter of the dreams. The elders begin asking who is dreaming of fire, or of teeth, or chewing sounds. They look at people's hands when they wake. Sometimes the fingertips are raw from scratching, or the nails are chewed. A bite mark on one's forearm that wasn't there the night before. And yet, despite their knowing, these elders are not immune. One of the old men, always known for his steady hand and steadier voice, begins forgetting words, simple words like snowshoe or rabbit. He starts speaking in a language he only half remembers, and usually stares off into the stew pot. The other elders begin to sit further from him, not out of cruelty, but sorrow. Sometimes the mind just gives up too early in the winter. There's no single rule book for survival. Each village remembers differently and protects itself in its own way. But across the tribes, there is one shared understanding. The Wendigo finds you not when you're weak, but when you're desperate. So the elders guide their people not by fear, but through basic rhythms, daily patterns, meals at fixed times, songs at dawn and dusk, trying to stimulate soft jokes around the fire. Routine is its own kind of safety, and when everyone moves in concert and in symphony, the hunger has fewer seams to slip through and bother their minds. Still, when the fire crackles too sharply or a branch snaps outside in the dead stillness, even the elders pause. They glance towards the flap of the lodge, not because they think something's out there watching, but just because they might be listening. They do not claim to understand it fully, but but they know how to live beside it, at least for a while. When the Wendigo begins claiming victims, it usually doesn't begin with blood. The ones who are claimed just start slipping in slow, invisible ways, like snowmelt through a crack in the roof, a little at a time, until suddenly you realize the whole lodge smells damp and the floor's ruined. And even then, it doesn't feel like a crisis because it happens so gently. A slow, spreading wrongness that people excuse. The man it chooses this time is not a stranger or a new person in the tribe. He's a middle son, not the strongest and not the cleverest, but dependable. The one who always sharpens the tools without being asked and fetches extra wood. He has a name, of course, but we'll leave it unwritten. It starts with his appetite. Not greed, he's just hungrier than usual. He's asking for second servings, and then thirds. At first people were pleased. A good appetite means good health. The cook smiles as he ladles out more stew, thick with marrow and smoked duck. The man thanks him, wipes the bowl clean with a scrap of bannock. But then he asks again and again, and when the food ran out, he went quiet. And later, when the lodge settled into sleep, someone heard him moving. Just his footsteps, slow and careful like someone trying not to wake a baby. In the morning, a sack of dried meat is gone, and his fingers smell faintly of tallow. No one says anything, not quite yet. It's too early to be making accusations. The next day he works hard. Too hard. He chops enough wood for 3 families, even though his breath fogs in short, shallow bursts. His cheeks are flushed, not just with exertion, but something hot and mean beneath his skin, like a fever. That night he doesn't eat with the others. He says that this time he isn't hungry, but he stares into the pot intently. Now the elders are watching, quietly. One sits near him with a bundle of sweetgrass in her lap, braiding it with hands that look like driftwood. And she doesn't speak to him, just watches the way he sits far too still. When he leaves to relieve himself, she bends down and brushes the earth where he was sitting, and her face darkens, but she says nothing. He begins waking in the night, very loudly. He's not screaming, but breathing like he's drowning. People begin sleeping with one eye open, watching him. Children are pulled closer to their parents. One woman quietly moved her entire family to a different lodge, under the excuse that her husband snores and will wake the others, even when he very much never has. The middle son stopped speaking in full sentences, not because he decided to be quiet, but because his words didn't quite match anymore. He says things like "I need" instead of "may I," without smiling. And when someone laughs nervously, he doesn't join in, just tilts his head slightly, like a dog hearing a sound it doesn't like. No one confronts him. That would be like telling a crack in the ice to behave. Instead, they just shift around him. He's no longer invited to fetch water or expected to stoke the fire. But that doesn't slow his fall. One morning, a rabbit is found torn apart near the edge of the village. Not cleaned or eaten, just ruined. Its entrails stretched across the snow like someone was trying to read them but didn't understand the language. This man was the first to find it. He said nothing, but he stood there, watching the steam rise from its body like breath. That night he didn't sleep. People heard him walking back and forth outside the lodges. Not pacing exactly, but more like drifting, waiting for something. One of the young girls peeked out through a tiny slit in the bark covering and saw him barefoot in the snow, toes blackened and eyes wide, staring up at nothing in the sky. The people now began to prepare the bindings, not ropes but rawhide soaked and dried hard. It's not for restraint, it's for hopeful recognition from him. If he struggles, he's still there and still remembers the smell of his people and their work. If he doesn't, if he accepts it too easily, then he's gone. But before they can use these bindings, he disappeared. At first light, his bedding was untouched. His parka was gone. No prints in the snow, just an open flap gently moving in the wind. The forest held its breath that day. The few birds remaining did not call, and the wind did not whistle even once. The children were also told not to speak above a whisper. And everyone listens, not for footsteps, but for the sound of dragging on the snow, the one that means that hunger has remembered to come by. The middle son returned the next evening, alone. His face was pale and his lips were cracked. Her eyes were sunken and shining too brightly. And now he's smiling. Not like someone who's found something to laugh about, but like someone who has decided to let go and found peace in that. He didn't ask for food or clothes. He just sat by the fire, hands outstretched, even though the flames barely warmed them. The heat seems to, if anything, avoid him. The people edged away, and one by one they leave the lodge, until only an elder remains, still braiding sweetgrass. She doesn't look at him or speak, she just braids, to keep the lodge feeling like home. When he fell asleep, the others returned. They didn't touch him. They left a bowl of broth nearby, as a final test. Not as nourishment, but because they needed to see. And in the morning it is still full and frozen solid, and there are teeth marks around the rim of the bowl now. At this point, there's no dramatic shouting and no angry mob, just resignation as they accept what's happened to him. The rawhide bindings are brought in and the fire is stoked high, and someone sharpens a long bone blade wrapped in red thread. He doesn't fight, he doesn't even twitch. When they bind him, he smiles again, calm and passive and peaceful. And they never say his name again. The lodges became quieter after that. Not in a frightened way, but in a way that a room feels silent after a long-held breath is let go. The man is gone, burned in the careful way that such things must be burned. Survival resumes because it has to. There's firewood to gather, roots to unearth, traps to check, children to hush. But even in routine, the people now move differently. Steps are lighter and doors are opened more slowly. Every action is measured, because every gesture is now a kind of offering to say, please, that's enough. There are no grand rituals declared in the wake of the Wendigo's visit. No great ceremony with painted masks or blood-soaked drums, or a wish for it to stay gone this time. But there are patterns, and these are their own kind of spell. The people begin to sleep with fresh cedar tucked behind their ears. Not because they think it stops anything or provides them with security, but because it smells like summer, and memories are the greatest protection. Meals grow simpler and leaner, nothing indulgent, and no one eats until they feel full anymore, only until they stop feeling hungry. Because now fullness is suspicious after one has fallen, because fullness has been shown to be greedy. Children are fed first, of course, and someone always watches as they eat. Not to scold, but gently remind. One elder sits cross-legged near the cooking hearth each night, chewing spruce gum slowly, his eyes flicking from bowl to bowl. Occasionally he'll nod. Once he gently took a second helping away from a boy who wasn't hungry and just bored. The boy doesn't even protest because he realized after. Clothing begins to carry symbols. Not tattoos or marks or intense braids. Just small things, discreet things. A spiral of sinew stitched into the sleeve of a coat, or a tuft of rabbit fur tied around the ankle, or 3 pine needles pressed into a leather cuff. In a season that hardens and kills everything with cold, these are small anchors of warmth and life to remind people that they are in fact still people. Some families start lighting 2 fires, one for cooking and one for watching. The watching fire is smaller and built outside the lodge, near the woodline, where it casts a faint glow into the dark. And old songs return, not cheerful ones and not always beautiful, but rhythmic and steady and familiar. Songs that circle the same phrase like a snowshoe path beaten down through repetition. One woman sings every time she stirs the stew. No one knows the words really, not even her. She hums through half of them, but when she forgets to sing, the entire room grows tense, so she reminds herself to keep trying. Sleep also becomes a very carefully managed thing. No one sleeps alone anymore. Even the elders who have spent decades mastering quiet and solitude allow the grandchildren to curl near their legs or another elder to share their blanket. People also start sleeping in shifts. One always stays half awake, pretending to doze, but really listening for breath that might turn shallow, or footsteps in the night that shouldn't be there. And then there's burning. Not people, not anymore, thankfully, but small things. Bits of leftover meat, bones with too much marrow, bark dolls that make someone feel uneasy. These are tossed into the flames with casual reverence. Not a show, but just like brushing one's teeth or sweeping the floor, it's maintenance, burning what might leave you with memories that you need to let go of, just like your hunger. The elders start to resume telling stories, not meant to warn about the Wendigo, but things that came before it. Stories of thunderbirds that crack the sky with life, or river serpents that sleep beneath frozen lakes. Not to distract, but to re-anchor. To remind that the world is not only teeth and hunger, but there's also songs about life and creation and the world itself growing. One boy asked why no one named the creature, and an elder replied without looking up, because names are an invitation, and we've already lost one by inviting it enough. Herbs are now burned regularly, not just for scent, but to cleanse breath. People exhale deeply through the smoke, as if hoping to cough up whatever cold is stuck in their ribs or sickness in their stomach. Children are taught to do it as part of morning routine, not with fear, but with some playfulness. Blow the frost away, one mother says, holding up a bundle of smoldering sage. Laughter still happens quietly and often nervously, but it starts to return. The kind that bubbles up when someone stumbles while carrying firewood, or when a dog sneezes into its own tail. These moments are cherished now, small, tart bursts of normalcy. There is still tension. One man refuses to eat for 2 days, not out of fear, but because he's ashamed of how much he'd eaten before. An elder sits with him through one long night, feeding him broth one spoonful at a time, telling him about a story where she accidentally tried to cook rocks because she mistook them for roots. The man laughs and then starts to eat again, and the whole camp believes that it might be time to go back to normal. But a young girl begins making small carvings, just of wooden animals, barely bigger than her thumb. She leaves them outside the lodge each night just to make the forest feel less empty. And one morning, one of the carvings is gone. In its place is a pine cone placed deliberately, standing upwards. And the camp begins to grow silent again. They thought it had been enough, that they were on their way back to the normal world. But this was a sign that their visitor might not have decided to move on and continues to overstay its welcome. The tracker did not volunteer, but no one ever really does. However, there comes a point when someone has to go into the woods. Not to hunt the Wendigo, that would be foolish, but simply to find out where exactly it is. And this role often falls to someone light-footed and light-tongued. This time it's a woman whose coat smells of rabbit and wood smoke, and whose laugh used to come easily, and whose eyes are now just a little too dry from sleeping poorly. She's known for her skill in tracking snowshoe hairs by broken moss, and the faintest smear left in the air. She has no name in this story either, because names will draw attention to things better left alone. So she prepares without announcing it. Her pack is light: a bone-handled knife, flint, some dried fish, and a coil of sinew, a rabbit's paw dyed red for luck, and a pouch filled with ash from the lodge where the man was burned. Before leaving, she stands beside the main fire, barefoot until her soles grow tough with soot. She hums one line of a hunting song and spits once into the flames. Not as a curse, just to remind the fire that she still belongs to the living. The others watch her go without ceremony. Instead, someone just offers her a strip of smoked caribou with no words, and she tucks it into her coat without tasting it. A child hands her a stone shaped vaguely like a bird. The forest greets her like a stranger who once was a friend. The trail is half-buried, but she doesn't follow it. The tracks are too obvious. Instead, she moves by the way the wind settles on bark, by the hush of branches brushing one another like dry hands. She sees signs and listens to the forest telling her where to check. Saplings are bent too low in some places, and ice is melted where sun shouldn't have reached. A patch of moss is disturbed by breath that smells like ash and copper in the air. She doesn't call out. She doesn't want it to realize that she's thinking about it. That night, she built a low fire that was more embers on a chunk of hardwood than licking flames. She chewed her fish slowly, counting her bites in pairs to make sure that she didn't overdo it. She wraps herself in silence in her coat and pins it with a sprig of spruce. The trees creak above her, but she sleeps with an ear open, and her hand resting lightly on her blade, though she's never used it against anything that walks like a man. Dreams began on the second night in the forest. Not nightmares, just slow whispering things. A pot boiling over with nothing inside. A mother feeding her child a bone that was twitching in its hand. Her own hands growing long and dark, cracking at the knuckles like frostbitten wood. She wakes before dawn and smells something burnt. There's nothing nearby, her fire extinguished long before, but the scent clings, like roasted fat mixed in with old meat. She ties a length of red-dyed sinew around her wrist. By the third day she found footprints. Not fresh or melting, but wrong. The snow around them refused to settle in and fill the space. Each print is hollow and long and narrow, like something that leans forward as it walks. She doesn't follow the prints directly, she circles around them and waits. The prints never change direction. She builds a tiny fire again and burns the red rabbit's paw. Then she makes an offering to the forest itself. A sliver of her smoked fish, a pine needle, the carved birdstone from the child. She says nothing, but she presses her forehead to the bark of the tree, not to pray, just to listen to the forest. A few hours later, she finds it. A circle where snow has not fallen, even though the sky has been weeping snowflakes all morning, and it's too quiet in this space. She steps no closer, just kneels nearby and touches the ground around this circle, and it's warm. She leaves a bundle of sage and crushed charcoal tied in sinew. Then she stands up and walks backward for 20 steps, knowing she shouldn't immediately give her back to that space. When she returned to the village, no one asks what she saw. Instead, someone offers her tea made from cedar tips, and she drinks it while keeping her eyes on the fire. The elders wait until nightfall before they ask their questions. The most important one of all being, did it move on? And she shakes her head. For the next few days, no one goes near the trees again. Children are given more chores that keep them near the fire, and the dogs are tied much closer to the lodge posts. Food is now seasoned more heavily with ash and bitter roots, flavors that aren't succulent or create impetulance in the person. The tracker says little now, but every morning she checks the edge of the village, just a glance in case she sees those prints again. And some nights she dreams of following her own footprints through the woods and seeing them suddenly stop. But thankfully she wakes each morning with her fingers still warm. By now the village has accepted that the Wendigo will not leave on its own, and the snow is hardened into brittle crusts. Firewood cracks louder than it should, and soup freezes between the ladle and the bowl if you dawdle just a little bit. Every task becomes sharper and more deliberate. There's no consensus on how to destroy it. That word destroy doesn't quite apply. The Wendigo is not a creature with a neck to snap or a heart to pierce. You don't really kill it, you just make it leave. Or more often you convince it that it has very much overstayed its welcome. The fire is not built in the center of the village, but at its edge, where the trees begin to press in and snow clumps like nervous thoughts. It's made wide, low, and hot, not for the heat it provides, but for transformation of whatever they put in it. This fire is fed in timed bursts, dry wood, pitch-soaked branches, and fistfuls of dried grass. And so they begin burning, and they start with food. Every family gives something. A whole rabbit, a precious slab of smoked moose, a pouch of dried berries gathered painstakingly in the last days of autumn. These are not tossed into the fire whole. They're prepared, they're either cooked or seasoned or arranged. The tracker places the first dish. She lays it on a flat stone near the tree line, where the wind always feels just a little curious. She whispers something to it and backs away. By morning, the plate is gone. That night, a dog that had gone missing returns, muddied and shivering, but alive. It sleeps curled against the fire, but it's still whimpering in its sleep, and the elders exchange looks. One says softly, "It is answered, but it is not satisfied." So they burn more, and instead of food this time they pick things, and things that carry memories. A boy gives up the toy his uncle carved before vanishing last year. He sets it into the fire himself, his lips tight. A woman burns her mother's beadwork pouch, frayed from use, heavy with smell and salt and memories. One elder offers his favorite pipe. He does not look away as he watches it blacken. Someone suggests burning the lodge where the first transformation took place, but another elder shakes her head and says it's a waste, as it wasn't the lodge that changed. One family confesses that they'd hidden extra food under their bedding during the lean days. Another admits they considered leaving one elder behind on a hunting trip to move faster. No one is punished for this. Instead, they light a small separate fire, and each confession is written in a bundle of herbs tied with strands of hair, bark peeled from trees. These are fed to the flames one at a time. The smoke from these fires smells sharper, like truth being released. In the days that follow, people speak more freely about hunger, fear, loneliness, their feelings. A man tells of a winter when he nearly stole from his cousin's child. A grandmother admits she once saw the Wendigo and pretended she didn't. These are not secrets anymore or ways to give strength. They are offerings. Each word of memory and connection weakens the grip of the Wendigo. There is one last thing to burn, and everyone knows it. It's the old tools. The red threaded blade, the bone pouch, the driftwood circle. They've served the village for generations, but they've grown heavy. You can't carry protection forever without it becoming part of the danger, because it carries the taint of the evil spirits around them. The tracker places each item into the fire herself. Her hands are not shaking, but when the bone blade, curls under the heat, she closes her eyes. The others stand around her, not too close, but together, letting the smoke wrap around them like a cloak. The flames crack and a gust of wind rises suddenly, loud and firm, as if exhaling. The fire snaps one final time, then dies abruptly, and the smoke clears up into the sky. Now the woods feel quiet in the right way. They're no longer waiting. The tracker steps back and brushes ash from her sleeves and walks away. No one speaks for the rest of the day almost. That night the fire in the lodge burns bright. It crackles healthily, and the air smells like spruce and something sweet instead of rotten. Now, despite this peace, the winter doesn't end suddenly. It never does. The thaw creeps in cautiously, testing each step. The icicles are shrinking by inches. Then the snow, once crisp and tight as a hide, begins to sag, slumping off the lodge roofs. Trees that once stood stiff with cold are now dripping slow and steady. The people are beginning to stretch again, literally at first, uncurling their shoulders, unwounding their spines from being hunched over, but figuratively too. Laughter returns in longer bursts. Children are allowed to play further from the lodges, chasing each other with sticks. The adults still watch the tree line, but now with suspicion rather than dread. No one announces that the Wendigo is gone. That would be bad manners. Instead, people speak of dreams becoming quieter, of meat tasting healthy again, or the way the wind sounds right now. Everyone can tell that life is returning to what they know it as. Now the tracker still walks the edge of the forest each morning. It's a new habit. She started tying new threads around her wrist to welcome the buds she hopes to see soon in the spring. She no longer feels watched, just alone, and that's a blessing. The elders have returned to their full volume. One grumbles loudly about someone forgetting to tan a hide properly. Another smacks a boy's hand away from the stew pot, but chuckles without malice. Even the most stoic among them have resumed humming tunelessly. Not all wounds are visible, and not all healing makes a sound, but it looks like everyone has begun returning to normal. But nothing goes entirely back to what it was. The place where the man vanished is never spoken of, but no one builds near it. The dog that returned with frostbite now has clouded eyes and stays at the edge of camp regularly. Content but distant, as if still dreaming. But the elders don't feel dangered by it. And the child who offered the stone bird now carves others by habit, more little figures of wood and bone. She doesn't explain why she tucks them under trees. The burned tools are not replaced. No new red-threaded blades or bone dust pouches. Instead, the people build memory into different things. Charcoal rubbed into the seams of their winter clothes, or songs passed to the young. Some ask why the Wendigo came this year and not the last, or why it didn't take more than it did. There is no real answer. It doesn't matter, really. When the thaw deepens and the ice breaks on the rivers, the people gather for the first real celebration in months. Nothing grand, but a shared meal and a story circle. No one mentions what they endured. Instead, they just talk idly and chat about beavers spotted near the creek, mushrooms pushing up through wet bark, or the time they saw a squirrel trying to steal their baby's mitten. The Wendigo was not defeated, but it was endured and then pushed away. And that's what survival is. It's not triumph or conquest, but endurance and making it to the brighter day. Knowing what to hold close to you and learning how to sing through frost-bitten nights. Somewhere beyond the trees, far enough that no one has to mind it, something may still be listening, but it no longer comes close to ruin their days and nights. People begin to dream again without waking in sweat. Thank you for staying with us through this long and snow-covered journey of action in careful, cautious steps. Your continued attention is greatly appreciated, and will be rewarded with another story now. When the leaves turned gold, and the sun lost its arrogant summer heat, something subtle shifted in the air. Not everyone noticed it, of course. Some children still tried to swim in cold streams, as if denial could extend the season. But for the older ones, the grandmothers shelling beans with fingers like dry bark, the men sharpening tools with the kind of focus reserved for both hunting and difficult conversations, it was clear. Winter was no longer a rumor. It was a fact. The preparations began without ceremony, though they held the weight of ritual. There was no single drumbeat that signaled the transition. Instead, it came in the crunch of leaves underfoot, the flick of a squirrel's tail, the light tilt in the wind. It came in the way every plant looked just a little more tired, as if they'd been working all year and were finally allowed to fall apart gracefully. In many native communities across the continent, from the dense forests of the northeast to the open plains of the west, the arrival of fall triggered an instinct older than anyone's memory. They didn't just prepare for winter, they listened for it. And in those moments, the world became a checklist, an enormous, wild, sacred pantry waiting to be emptied with care. You might expect frantic gathering, but this was a people attuned to cycles, not emergencies. No one was racing against time, unless a snowstorm rolled in ahead of schedule, which, to be fair, it often did. But otherwise, everything moved with that calm sense of inevitability that you get when you've done this 50 times before, or in some cases, 500. Elders pointed out which berries were still safe to eat, and which had started fermenting into something better left to birds and bold mistakes. Children were given baskets not to play with, but to fill, though more often than not, their contents ended up being a mix of actual food and whatever shiny things caught their attention. Occasionally a beetle, sometimes someone's missing dental ornament. There was, in some areas, a strict logic to what got gathered first. Choke cherries had a narrow window before going bitter. Wild rice was best when the heads bowed low, offering themselves to the canoe's gentle brushing. On the Great Plains, the bison herd movements created a map unto themselves, one drawn not in ink, but in hoofprints and torn grasses. To someone unfamiliar, the land looked quiet. To those who knew better, it was a loud, generous thing, buzzing with opportunity, warnings, and dinner options. In the Pacific Northwest, families moved between seasonal camps, following the patterns of ripening and runoff. The Salish and Macaw, for instance, returned to coastal sites when the salmon ran thick in the rivers, while in the Southwest, the Hopi and Zuni tended to crops that seemed to grow in defiance of logic and rainfall. Corn, beans, and squash, the three sisters, were sometimes gathered at the same time, their fates braided like the stories that explained their existence. One Hopi tale told of a corn spirit that grew tired of being picked too early and cursed an entire village with stomach aches. It was, depending on the teller, either a lesson in patience or an ancient way of telling children not to snack before dinner. Every person had a job, And that wasn't just cultural, it was practical. Winter was not an abstraction. It was something that ate those who underestimated it. So when you were sent to gather, you didn't drag your feet. Unless, of course, you were the kind of person who believed the spirits would protect you even from laziness. In which case, you were probably also the kind of person who spent the coldest months being given the smallest portions. There's a sort of ancient sarcasm that lives in native oral tradition. One winter, a boy tried to joke about how he didn't need to help gather because he planned to eat his dreams. Come January, someone slipped him a bowl of nothing and called it dream soup. It was apparently a little bland. And then there was the weather, ever dramatic, ever unpredictable. One day warm enough to convince you to wear lighter clothes, and the next frost appeared on your eyelashes. A poorly timed storm could scatter days of work, ruin a cache of drying herbs, or turn a berry-rich hillside into a frozen hazard. But people adapted, paths were remade, food was traded between neighbors, and somewhere between the slipping sun and the deepening shadows, you learned to appreciate how quickly the world moved when you weren't looking. The early part of fall smelled like wet stone and pine bark. Your hands, stained from berries or pitch, carried the scent of the season long after washing them. The taste of wind-shivered apples was sharper than anything grown in orderly rows. And the way the stars came out earlier and bolder, like someone turning down the lamp so you'd focus, reminded everyone that darkness wasn't something to be feared. It was something to be prepared for. By the time birds began flying in V-shaped warnings, most of the serious foraging had begun in earnest. And even though the work was endless and the splinters frequent, there was something oddly comforting in the routine. A kind of seasonal choreography. Everyone moving together with practiced steps, no one waiting on applause, just the promise of full bellies and stories by firelight. Even the dogs noticed the change. Their ears perked more often and their pace was more alert. Not because they feared the winter, but because they recognized what it brought. Warmth, closeness to their masters, and the kind of quiet that only comes when snow covers every regret you forgot to bury. Digging into the earth was less about brute force and more about memory. The ground didn't give up its treasures easily, but it did reward those who remembered where to look. Long before metal spades and modern shovels, the people relied on pointed sticks, carved antler tools, and a very well-developed sense of, that looks like the right patch of dirt. And it usually was. Camas bulbs, wild onions, yampa, and bitter roots. These were not glamorous foods. They didn't sparkle like berries, or swagger like the fresh shine on meat. But they filled stomachs and kept the cold at bay when little else could. And in many ways, they were the unsung backbone of winter meals. Quiet, starchy, and surprisingly opinionated when cooked poorly. The camas harvest, for example, wasn't something you just stumbled into. It required timing, sharp eyes, and a good understanding of plants that pretended to be helpful but were secretly out to make you sick. Blue camas bulbs were edible and delicious when slow roasted in an earth oven for 24 hours. Death camas, which looked nearly identical, was just as enthusiastic, but about ending your life. So identification mattered quite a lot. That's why elder women led most of the digging parties. Their eyes, despite decades of smoke, sun, and grandchildren's nonsense, were sharper than any guidebook. They could tell by the leaf's bend, the bulb's curve, even by the soil around it. If you tried to guess, they'd let you know, with a look that could wither a pine cone. In the plateau regions, women carried special woven bags lined with pitch to keep moisture from spoiling the roots, and there was often a ceremonial air to the first dig of the season. Not because anyone was lighting incense or chanting, but because the act itself was sacred. You were borrowing from the earth, not just taking. The roots were roasted in pit ovens, wide holes lined with hot stones, covered in moss and sealed with dirt. It wasn't fast food. You started in the morning, and maybe you were eating by next sunrise. But when the roots came out, they were sweet and soft and sticky in the best way. Like nature's version of caramelized onions, but with less crying in the process. There's a southern Ute story about a man who tried to speed up the roasting process by building a smaller fire with less stone. His roots came out crunchy, half raw, and vaguely insulting. The story ends with his grandmother scolding him publicly, and his nickname being changed to something like "eats rocks on purpose." Depending on the storyteller, it might also include a skunk attack. In colder regions, like among the Ojibwe or Cree, root gathering often came after the first frost. That chill did something to the sugars, made them richer, more concentrated. People claimed the roots tasted sweeter if the harvesters sang while digging. And whether or not that's botanically accurate, it made for a good mood. And sometimes for good teasing when someone was caught singing off-key. These plants had a kind of mythic patience. They waited underground all year, growing slowly, storing sunlight and minerals like misers. They didn't ask for any attention, and they didn't bloom in flashy colors. But come winter, when snow blanketed the world and meat ran out, it was the bitter root mash or the roasted kamas that reminded everyone. Survival lay in the simple thing. One curious detail often overlooked by outsiders was the way tribes cultivated wild plants without ever calling it farming. In some regions, people returned vegetable scraps to the same location year after year, spreading the skins and trimmings to encourage regrowth. In others, they deliberately left behind a few roots, ensuring future harvests. It wasn't agriculture in the European sense, it was something older, a kind of partnership with the land, where both parties understood their roles and neither tried to overtake the process. And there was etiquette. You didn't dig everything, and you never took the first one you saw, and you certainly didn't brag about how many roots you'd found, unless you were prepared for someone older and more experienced to loudly correct your count and remind you that roots don't dig themselves up. On the plains, the harvesting of prairie turnips, timpsula, was nearly an event unto itself. These plants had long, carrot-like roots that required serious effort to remove. People used digging sticks shaped almost like oars, levering each root out of the stubborn soil. It was said you could tell a person's marriage prospects by how cleanly they dug a turnip. Crooked root, crooked path ahead. And of course, like every group effort, there were roles. One group dug, another processed. Children fetched water or sang to the elders, and at least one person was responsible for swatting flies and telling jokes, usually the same person who'd mysteriously avoided the heaviest baskets. But underneath the humor and the casual scolding, there was something profound happening. Each dig, each roasted root, was a kind of memory, a taste of childhood, or a story passed down, a reminder that the ground remembers those who respect it. By the time the sun started dipping earlier behind the hills, most storage bags were half full, and most knees were sore, but the work wasn't done. The roots would be dried, crushed, or packed into bark-lined baskets and stored in cache pits. Cool and dark places where food waited patiently for the days when snow claimed every path. And in the back of every mind, quietly nestled like the bulbs themselves, was the certainty that when the world turned white and sharp, there would still be something earthy, warm, and grounding to eat. Maybe not glamorous, but very dependable. Smoke curled through the trees like a lazy whisper, clinging to the skins of everyone nearby. The smell was stubborn, part pine and part meat, but part memory. And if it got into your hair, you'd carry it for days. Which was the point. It wasn't just cooking, it was preservation. It was survival, seasoned with patience and just the faintest pinch of passive aggressiveness when the wind shifted that smoke directly into someone's eyes. Across native communities, preserving meat for winter wasn't a single task. It was a series of perfectly timed maneuvers. First there was the hunt, a group effort that demanded both reverence and accuracy. In the plains, bison were brought through elaborate drives, corralling entire herds towards drop-offs or narrow valleys. A good day meant food for dozens. A bad day meant stories about what almost happened. When the hunt succeeded, there was no delay. The butchering began immediately. Hands, bone tools, and stone knives worked quickly, separating muscle from sinew, organs from fat, and hide from flesh. Everyone had their station. Even children had roles, carrying water, collecting firewood, and making faces at the smellier organs. But it was the drying and smoking that turned a successful hunt into a winter's insurance policy. Meat was sliced thin, hung on racks, and cured with smoke that mingled with herbs or specific woods, depending on the tribe and the desired taste. Cedar smoke added a sharp edge, while cottonwood lent a sweeter note. And then there were those who threw in wild sage, not just for flavor, but because it kept away flies. Among the Lakota and other plains groups, dried meat, or wasna, was sometimes pounded into powder and mixed with rendered fat and berries. The result was pemmican, a dense, nutritious food that could survive any conditions, tough enough that even ravenous teenage boys didn't run through it too quickly. In the Pacific Northwest, salmon was the reigning monarch of meat preservation. When the runs came thick in the rivers, families turned their homes into fish factories. Salmon were split, cleaned, and hung from tall racks, the oily smell drifting for miles. Dogs hovered hopefully, and ravens made comments from nearby trees. At least one uncle always insisted his salmon rack dried better because he whistled to it daily. No one believed him, but everyone let him do it. The drying process wasn't just for efficiency, it was precision. Too much smoke and the meat tasted like burnt socks. Too little and it spoiled. You needed just the right draft, a balance of warmth and air that could only be judged by experience. Thermometers hadn't been invented yet, but an elder's nose was as sharp as any modern tool. Salt was used when it was available, especially closer to the coasts. Inland people relied more on air, fat, and technique, and fat was never wasted. It was rendered down into tallow and stored in animal stomachs, bladder sacs, or carefully carved vessels. Some communities even made bone grease. They would boil bones to yield the final calories and then cooled the liquid into a spreadable, high-energy paste that probably would have made a fortune in today's protein bar market. One particularly beloved method was layering dried meat with berries and fat inside hollowed-out sections of bark or hide, then sealing it with more tallow. The result looked unassuming, but held enough energy to fuel a snowbound hunting trip or a long afternoon of storytelling. There's even a tale among the Dene of a man who survived a 3-day blizzard with nothing but 2 pemmican balls, a good fire, and his uncle's endless ghost stories. He apparently begged the storm to return before the 4th tale started. Preservation wasn't only about practicality, it was about respect. Every part of the animal was used, and what couldn't be consumed was honored in other ways. Bones became tools or needles. Sinew turned into thread. Stomachs became cooking vessels or storage pouches. Nothing was wasted, and not because of scarcity, but because the relationship between people and food was built on mutual recognition. You gave thanks because you were taking life. In some tribes, like the Blackfoot, there were songs sung during the drying process. Low, rhythmic verses that helped pass time and reinforced memory. Some songs were funny, others were mournful. One was known to be entirely about a hunter who tripped over his own spear and ruined an entire deer leg. His name, lovingly preserved in the lyrics, loosely translated to falls while bragging. And let's not forget the drama of smoke direction. If you've never tried to stand next to a smoky rack on a breezy day, you don't know the true meaning of stubborn discomfort. The smoke always found your eyes, no matter where you stood. Children were known to pretend they didn't notice, adults cursed politely, and one elder was said to have worn a basket on his head with eye holes cut out just to make a point. All this effort culminated in piles of dried meat, layered neatly in bark-lined baskets, tucked into caches, and sealed from moisture. Come winter, these strips were rehydrated in stews, ground into flour, or chewed as is with the kind of enthusiasm only hunger can justify. And when the storms rolled in, when the snow turned every hill into a white wall, and silence pressed down like another layer of sky, those smoky strips of meat carried not just nutrition, but gratitude. They were whispers of motion, of firelight, crisp mornings, and laughter carried on the wind. They were proof that preparation wasn't just practical, it was ancestral. If meat was the centerpiece of winter meals, then seeds were the background orchestra, quiet, essential, and frequently underappreciated until something went wrong. They didn't crackle like a fire-roasted bone or glisten like fresh salmon, but they were just as vital. And unlike meat, which required a chase or at least a good aim, seeds demanded patience, finesse, and the kind of fingers that could sort tiny hulls without turning bitter from boredom. Sunflower seeds, pine nuts, acorns, amaranth, and wild grass grains, each with its own season, region, and quirky rules. The gatherers of these quiet calories often knew more about timing than the best meteorologist. If you picked too early, the seeds weren't mature. Too late, and the birds had thrown a party without inviting you. And if you had the misfortune of picking during a windstorm, well, let's say you'd be chasing your dinner through a prairie field and reconsidering your life choices. Take the pine nut, for instance, a prized fat source in high elevations among tribes like the Shoshone and Paiute. These little kernels were locked inside thick cones that required fire, roasting, or prolonged staring and muttered threats. The process was usually communal, because breaking into cones alone was like opening a bank vault with a toothpick. Then there were sunflowers, grown and gathered particularly in the central and southern plains. Their seeds were a delight to collect, if you didn't mind being swarmed by yellow jackets or having your ankles tickled by grass snakes. People dried the sunflower heads whole, then rubbed them vigorously against rough hide or bark to release the seeds. One Dakota elder claimed that the best technique involved angry rubbing. No one asked what that meant. Once harvested, seeds were parched, gently toasted in clay pots or over hot stones, to drive off moisture and discourage pests. Some seeds popped like corn, others just sighed and crackled inwards. The sound was oddly satisfying, like a laugh from the earth itself. Afterward, seeds were ground, stored in hide pouches or coiled baskets, and tucked into dry storage. The baskets, by the way, were masterworks of engineering. Tight, flexible, and often waterproofed with pitch, they could hold fine flour or whole seeds with not a single escapee. Acorns were another marvel, especially among tribes in California, like the Miwok or Chumash. To the untrained eye, an acorn looks like squirrel food. To native gatherers, it was a complex carbohydrate bomb waiting to be detoxified. First, the acorns were collected by the sackful, usually by women and children, sometimes with long poles used to shake the trees in a way that both terrified nearby birds and amused nearby elders. Then they were shelled, pounded into flour, and leached with cold water for hours or days to remove bitter tannins. One practice involved letting the tannin-rich water run through sand or moss beds, which filtered it gently while also doubling as a kind of earth-based spa treatment for the hands. After enough washing, the resulting flour was cooked into mush, bread, or flat cakes that could last for weeks, if not accidentally eaten during the first night. Amaranth, wild rice, and goosefoot were cultivated in scattered regions, often referred to in modern times as pseudo-grains, a term which implies they didn't try hard enough to be real cereal. But back then they were valued for what they were: filling, flexible, and portable. Wild rice in particular required canoe harvesting, gliding gently through stalks, bending them over the boat, and tapping to release the grains. The rhythm was peaceful, even hypnotic, broken only by the occasional misstep that landed someone's lunch directly in the water. And there was etiquette. You never stripped a whole patch, you never harvested angry, and you definitely didn't hoard. Seeds were finicky things. They responded to care. And as the stories went, a greedy gatherer might find their next year's crop mysteriously vanished or guarded by an animal with a grudge. Seed gathering was also deeply communal. Elders passed down knowledge not through speeches, but through gestures, habits, and sarcastic commentary. That's not a seed, one might say. That's a pebble, unless you're planning to plant rocks this winter. Laughter was a part of the rhythm. So was song. It was short, repetitive chants that made the work feel less like work, and more like being part of something ancient and ongoing. There's a little-known tradition among some Pueblo peoples where seed gatherers would smear a bit of ash on their cheeks to keep the wind from drying their skin. Children thought it made them look like warriors. Adults knew it was just clever skincare. But it became part of the image. Figures walking through the fields, baskets at their hips, ash-streaked cheeks, and sun hats fashioned from woven reeds or spare stubbornness. When night came, the seed piles were checked, rechecked, then checked again. Tiny things tend to disappear, or invite unwanted company, like mice, birds, or even raccoons. One elder swore that a chipmunk once made off with half of a sack of sunflower seeds in a single night. No one could prove it, but someone did sketch a rather guilty-looking chipmunk on the storage hut wall as a warning. Cold water has a way of demanding respect. It bites at your skin and numbs your fingers, and makes even the bravest rethink every life choice that led to kneeling behind an icy stream at dawn. And yet that's exactly where many native communities found one of their most reliable winter food sources: fish. Slippery, silvery, stubborn fish, darting through frigid waters like quick jokes at the expense of anyone trying to catch them. But where cold made others retreat, these communities adapted. They didn't fish with brute force, they fished with geometry, timing, and a stubborn understanding of nature. Fish traps were the quiet stars of this practice. Ingeniously simple, they used rocks, branches, and woven reeds to funnel fish into tight corners or holding pools. Some traps looked like upside-down baskets staked into the riverbed. Others were long, narrow corrals built from branches, curving like the arms of a patient grandmother. The fish, unaware of their role in the upcoming stew, swam obligingly into these mazes, right up until the exit narrowed. Tribes like the Yurok, Salish, and Nez Perce turned fish trapping into a community ritual. Knowing where the salmon ran, when the trout gathered, and when the eel slithered upstream was a rhythm. In some regions, special fishing weirs spanned entire rivers, looking less like traps and more like wooden architecture. Not every fish was fair game. There were taboos, seasons, and polite understandings with the natural world. Some fish were only taken during certain moons. Others were avoided entirely if they swam in pairs, rumored to be lovers, or worse, watchers sent by river spirits to judge the community's greed. No one wanted to be the one who ate the wrong fish and invited bad weather. One lesser-known trick involved freezing. In colder climates, like among the Inuit and Cree, fish were sometimes caught under the ice using bone hooks or carved lures. Holes were chiseled through the thick surface, and fish were teased upwards like tiny aquatic gamblers betting on the wrong game. If done well, it resulted in a full net. If done poorly, it resulted in very cold fingers and a lecture from someone who claimed to have caught a trout. Then there were fish spearers, the patient few who stood ankle-deep in cold water, unmoving for what felt like days. They held long spears tipped with bone or antler, eyes scanning for the faintest flicker of movement. Though occasionally it became a comedy, like the time a spear throw missed so wildly that the fish was allegedly insulted and swam in circles. Fish were cleaned on the spot. Knives made from obsidian or flint sliced through soft bellies with practiced ease. Heads were removed and guts were fed to dogs or returned to the river as thanks. Every part was respected. The skins were stretched and dried. The bones were crushed in for broth. Even the oil, extracted through boiling or pressing, was stored in hide bags or hollow gourds, later rubbed on skin to protect against wind, or stirred into stews to combat blandness. Among the Iroquois and other eastern woodland tribes, eels were a prized catch, rich, oily, and oddly cooperative when cornered. They were smoked or dried on racks, their oils considered medicinal. One elder joked eels were like helpful snakes, but tastier. That joke was repeated enough that it became a lesson. In coastal areas, clams and mussels were collected from shallow beds at low tide. Children loved this task, digging in the mud, collecting shellfish, and occasionally starting impromptu mud wars. Shellfish were boiled, smoked, or strung up on thin wooden skewers to dry, their shells later ground into tools, beads, or trade goods. Nothing was wasted. Among the Tlingit, dried fish were sometimes layered between strips of seaweed like the world's first soggy lasagna. The combination kept better in moist climates and traveled well. It also confused dogs who couldn't decide if it was food or something that had just washed ashore. In the evenings, as the day's catch hung above low fires or rested in shaded storage pits, the air filled with a comforting mix of smoke, salt, and satisfaction. Conversations drifted around the fire about fish that got away or fish that seemed to make eye contact before being speared. And when winter wrapped the rivers in glass, when the sound of running water became a memory under frozen silence, the people stayed fed not because they had fought to grab the fish, but because they had learned its rhythms. The moment the food was gathered, processed, and safely stashed didn't signal the end of the season. It simply marked a shift. The urgency faded into something looser, warmer, and more social. And what better way to confirm you'd be prepared for winter than by eating a large portion of it early? That's what feasts were for. Not recklessness, but a ritual, a shared celebration where abundance became a language, and generosity the dialect. Across countless native communities, the act of sharing food was about giving honor. To receive was to accept place within a relationship. Among the Iroquois, the harvest feast was as structured as it was symbolic. The three sister grains were honored not only as food, but as a form of grandmother and caretakers of human survival. Meals were sometimes accompanied by dances, with rhythms reflecting the swaying of stalks or the looping vines of squash. If it sounds poetic, it was. It was the kind of embodied gratitude that they'd love to perform for the world. In the southwest, the Zuni and Hopi gathered in plazas for communal cooking. Massive stews stirred in clay pots the size of bathtubs, flatbread baked against hot stones, steam mingling with breath in the early evening. Children ran between legs, and dogs begged from everyone except their owners. Feasts also had political weight. Leaders were measured not only by words or battle, but how well they hosted. A good chief made sure everyone left full and happy. A great one made sure no one noticed the chief had served himself last. Treat someone well at the table, and you might just earn an ally. Serve something undercooked, and you might earn a story that outlives your grandchildren. Among the Yupik and other Arctic groups, feasting often followed successful hunts. When a whale or caribou was brought in, it wasn't cut into pieces in isolation, it was portioned all together. Certain cuts went to certain families. Tongue and liver might go to elders or gifted storytellers, and the bones were returned to the land or sea, as if to say thank you, come again. Even during leaner years, the impulse to share held strong. One winter tale from the Lenape tells of a family who had only one small pot of beans, but invited guests anyway. They poured water into the stew and let it simmer longer. The guests left warm and satisfied. The next day, a herd of deer wandered into their camp. Another lesser-known but still charming tradition among the plateau tribes involved holding mock feasts, where children were given pretend roles and acted out the entire process using toy-sized portions. It was play, but it was also surprisingly delicious, until someone got too ambitious with wild onions. As night falls after a feast, the hearths glow and voices soften, and that gentle fullness settles into the bones. The winter would still come, and the snow would still fall, but in those hours, surrounded by food and stories and singing, you remembered why people prepared so carefully, not just to survive, but to gather together, to feed each other not just with calories, but with the strength of human connection.